and the next session is on the Mahabharata Cultural Heritage, Travel and Adaptation 2. And this will be chaired by Professor Krishil Devdasan, Professor and Head Department of English, University of Delhi. This session has two presenters, Dr. Anjana Sharma, who is Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Delhi, and Bhavya C., who is from Central University of Hyderabad.
Welcome everyone very warmly to this session on another kind of cultural travel and the Mahabharata. This will bring us papers on two reworkings of the Mahabharata, the Indonesian Mahabharata that Dr. Anjana Sharma will be talking to us about, and then the Mahabharata from Malaysia that Bhavya will be talking to us about. I begin by welcoming Dr. Anjana Sharma and inviting her to make her presentation. She has a range of interests: 19th century British Romanticism, visual culture, and a sense of the developing importance of intra and inter-Asian cultural sharing. Anjana.
I'm going to be speaking in many parts, so I'm going to keep fishing out things, because I have, in organizing this conference, not been able to organize myself as successfully as I would like to organize myself. So I'm a bit fragmented, and I think that's suitable because the Mahabharata is also like that. It tells many stories in many ways. So I'm actually going to talk about a novel which has just been introduced in India in the year 2016. The third cover that you're seeing, the one which is completely on the right, which is very beautifully designed with the flowers and amba and the dark like a wayang puppet. That's the one that has just been published in 2016 in India by Speaking Tiger. So I'm tracing a kind of trajectory of this text, its connections with the Mahabharata, with the Indonesian Mahabharata, and of course the question of how gender, patriarchy, histories, travel, locations of texts and readings of texts, and how the Mahabharata continues to be read not only as a text in a time past, but how it continues to be used even in other places and other cultures as a means of examining their own historical locations and some of their own historical tangles. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the two epics have traveled so well. They travel intensely well because they have the capacity to absorb and adapt to different cultures, because they are asking questions which really have to do with how human beings are and how they see themselves, and particularly how human beings are vis-a-vis other human beings. In part, the introduction to my talk has come from the two Indonesian presenters, but I may have to reprise some of that territory for the purposes of my presentation. So I was really looking at the Rajagopalachari translation of the Mahabharata, which may not be the most scholarly translation of the Mahabharata, and it certainly isn't, in that sense, for an academic perspective, probably not the most scholarly in the sense it has absolutely no glosses, addendums, footnotes, citations. But I think it is the fact that it still continues to be published and is still continuing to be in circulation is a sign of the real health of this particular edition, because we in academia believe in the edition which would be the best edition from which to teach our students. But we are looking at a text which has a life which is very far away from the classrooms that we inhabit. So I chose the Rajagopalachari translation for that very reason. I also chose it because there are various editions, and he writes a preface, even if it's a short one-pager, for every single edition. And he tries to locate the Mahabharata in a larger matrix of cultural travel and assimilation, and textual assimilation, and then religious assimilation. But he's speaking in the fourth edition, which is the 1955 edition. He says this. He's, of course, thanking Bharati Vidya Bhavan, and he's saying it's been a huge success, over 1 million copies, probably 2 million by now, of this text have been marketed. But he says something towards the end of the fourth edition preface, which I just want to read out very quickly, which is, the sages of our land had never thought of land or sea boundaries. And I think the presentations that we have been hearing, particularly the presentations we just heard before I came on to speak, testify that from 1955 to 2017 that we are, this actually holds true. And I think it is very important for me to mention this, because we are, through this conference, also trying to dismantle boundaries. And one of the ways we dismantle boundaries is through projects that are located in the liberal arts and the humanities, because of their refusal to accept that ideas stop where walls are built or rivers are. Ideas actually travel through rivers. And the Mahabharata is one such instance of it. So he says, so I repeat that again, the sages of our land never thought of land or sea boundaries. They thought in all things for all mankind, and we are fulfilling their intention when we render their classics in a English form. So I was very happy to read that, because there is a sort of narrative authenticity, a crisis of authenticity that we are facing right now in the times that we live in, which is, if it is not in the language in which it was first sort of written, it is not an authentic text. It is some sort of aberration from the origin. Now I'm going to sort of move from there into the story of Amba. Now, Amba's story comes on very quickly in the Mahabharata, as we know. It's a story which is, I'm mixing up my paper with somebody else who's abandoned their paper here, so I'll fish out mine. I'd like to just begin this. I'll begin with actually where Retno kind of stopped, which is about how absolutely popular, if I may use that word advisedly, the Mahabharata is in Indonesian culture. And in fact, in my conversations with my fellow Indonesians, what has become very apparent is they actually forget very often that the Mahabharata originated in India. They think of it as their text, speaking of their culture. So I'm going to read a little bit about the Mahabharata in Indonesia to begin with, before I start talking about the text that I am speaking about. So the popularity actually begins from a television show on the Mahabharata, which was a 2013, and I think it's still airing in some other channel, show of the Mahabharata. This is not the original Mahabharata, the B.R. Chopra one, but this is a 2013 Star Plus Mahabharata, which I think is still showing in Epic channel or somewhere. Now, so my point of entry into my presentation is this. The popularity of a show based on the Mahabharata in Muslim majority Indonesia, and this is important, might seem surprising, but Hindu epics are part of the country's culture. And this is part of the great success of cultural syncretism, which Indonesia has really practiced and demonstrated over a long period of time. For centuries, many parts of the Indonesian archipelago were majority Hindu. Now, also in Retno's presentation and also in the combination of Hindu-Buddha is very interesting for us, because in India, Hindu and Buddha will not be hyphenated. They would be on different, there would be a wall between the two. But in the imagination of Indonesia, Hindu-Buddha is one. It's one. It's part of the syncretic culture. By the 7th century CE, Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms dominated both Java and Sumatra, Indonesia's two most populous islands. Ever since then, Hindu cultural norms have infused indigenous mores, even after a large-scale conversion to Islam in the 16th century, which was also referred to. Now, what is also very interesting is that the conversion to Islam from the 16th century onwards in Indonesia happened through something that was actually a carrier of the Mahabharata, which is the wayang shadow puppet. So the wayang shadow puppet, which was the way in which the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were told to largely Hindu practicing people in Java and Bali, are then used by those who bring in Islam because they realize that's the best way to do cultural penetration. So, despite the conversion, it continued to flourish and be used. References to the epics are everywhere in Java. Now, I'm going to share some interesting, I think, and funny example. The language, the street signs, the political commentary are all influenced by the epics. In Jakarta, many buses are painted with lurid advertisements for an energy drink which is called Kuku Bima. So Coca-Cola, Kuku Bhima, which promises what? Bhim-like endurance. There is a nationwide charitable foundation, and it's called the Nakul and Sahadev Society. So it's very interesting because Nakul and Sahadev get short shrift in India, but in Indonesia they become the name of a charitable society. And of course, before I turn to Amba, it's also said that what has happened in Indonesia is that the Hindu epics are not really associated with religion anymore for Indonesian audiences. So they have decentered and moved very far away from their religious locations. Instead, they are understood as morality tales that happen to be embedded in local culture. So it is an indigenous narrative of the Mahabharata that we are sort of looking at. So, as I've said earlier, Indonesians really feel a real strong sense of ownership of the epics. And if you heard the presentations, you heard that actually, that this is our epic and this is how we work with this epic. In the mid-19th century, Rongo Warsito, a poet from a royal court in central Java, wrote an apocryphal history, again that was referred to, that traced the lineage of the Javanese king back to the Pandavas, and it was just mentioned earlier. So, story of origins in India and in Indonesia has the same source story. Eventually, many Indonesians came to believe that the Mahabharata was set in Java rather than in India. So, but India still, we are happy to know, has a special appeal. So we are bracketed with it, but we are not the center of the narrative. Now, the novel that I am looking at by Lakshmi Pamunjak, Amba, you see the first title, which is in Indonesian. The second one is in a translation. It was written in Bahasa initially, and then it was translated by the author into English. The second one is the German edition, and the third is the English edition, which has now been published in 2016 in India and is in circulation in many places. Now, this is a bestseller. It is one of the ways in which, along with a couple of others which I'm not mentioning, it really introduced Indonesian storytelling traditions, Indonesian literature to a world audience. 2015 was the year of Indonesia at the Frankfurt Book Fair. We all know that the Frankfurt Book Fair is really the place in which what is excellence in literature, who it is that we are going to read now, which culture are we going to examine, is sort of displayed and established. So in 2015, there was a clutch of Indonesian writers, quite a few of them women, whose works and writings were presented, and Indonesia was a host and guest of that particular 2015 event at the Frankfurt Book Fair. Amba, the novel written by Lakshmi Pamunjak, was one of the celebrity texts and celebrity novels that was presented over there. So Amba, of course, it tells you the story of Bhishma, and interestingly, it tells you the story of Salva, Bhishma, but more importantly, it tells you a story of Shikhandi, who will eventually destroy and kill Bhishma. But what this story is used for in the writing by Pamunjak is to tell a story which is still not being told in Indonesia very often, which is the story of what happened in Indonesia from 1965 to 1968. So I'm going to share a bit of that history because the text is actually a retrospective narrative, and it's looking back at the history of Indonesia which, as I said, is not very much in circulation. It actually looks at a period from 1965 to 1968 in the Suharto regime, who was the person who took over from what is now named as a benign dictatorship of Sukarno. So Suharto takes over from Sukarno, and the event is the way the transfer happens, of course, in good Mahabharata tradition through a bloodbath. So what happens in 1965? There is an apparent failed coup, and the failed coup is led by generals who apparently wish to kill Sukarno. That coup is stopped, but all of those generals are executed. I will not go into the history of it because there is no time, but the killing of the generals, the failure of the coup, meant that the power now passed from Sukarno to Suharto, who was also a military general. A major general in the army at that time, Suharto blamed the coup on communists, ousted President Sukarno, the country's first post-independence leader, and sanctioned a hunt for those responsible. Now, that is a narrative which is now being remembered 50 years later by many documentary filmmakers and writers in Indonesia. Amba is just, by the way, one example of this history of remembering, of a refusal to accept an official history which doesn't quite fit in with the version that is historically possibly more accurate. So I'm going to talk now about why Lakshmi Pamunjak felt the need to write this in 2012. Because she's kind of looking back at the history of her people, and she says there was a 50th anniversary of one of the most crushing episodes of Indonesian history, which is the massacre of some 500,000. Accounts differ on this one. Certain accounts say maybe 1 million perished in the communist purges. Certain others say 500. But since this is a history which has never been written down, it has been, in fact, not archived. And that is equally important. In a history that was not archived, then the novelistic space becomes a means to archive that which was not archived. So what happens is that there was a massacre of alleged communists between 1965 and 1968 by the Suharto regime, and now the business of confronting that past, which is traumatic and difficult, has begun with a new sense of urgency. And Lakshmi Pamunjak says that almost 20 years, Suharto, by the way, 1998 was the last time that he was there, and he passed away recently. Even 20 years later, there is a sense that you can't quite speak about this kind of rupture that occurred within the country. And I think the Mahabharata again becomes very, very important because it is actually a fratricidal. It is a fight between a family, two sets of brothers, all the other people who are attached to these brothers. And so in that sense, the Mahabharata becomes a very good way to speak about what happened in Indonesia when brother turned upon brother, depending on what were the political sympathies. And there is a desire on the part of writers like Pamunjak to remind people of this complete failure to remember a past. In fact, Pamunjak says in many, many interviews that what has happened is that people like her, educated elite, younger, they had never read in their history textbooks about this event. So they grew up with the sense that they grew up with no sense that this happened. And when the discovery that this had happened slowly started emerging in the public domain in the second decade of the 21st century, writers, activists, filmmakers, documentary filmmakers decided that they needed to interject themselves into the public domain, into the public sphere, and write about it. And what she says is that school and college-going kids, even till today, are not aware of this history. So this historical narrative is linked with the historical narrative of another country, of another story, which has now become the story of their own country. In fact, Pamunjak says, absurdly, not only has this steady propaganda produced a generation schooled in silence and apathy, it has also given birth to successive generations that are wholly ignorant of that period of history. In fact, she says a survey published by the Jakarta Globe in the year 2009, about 9 years, 8 years over from now, showed that more than half of the respondents, comprising university students in Jakarta, had never even heard of the mass killings of 1965 to 1968. So this silence is broken by Amba. It says here the color red, but the title is The Question of Red. So, red in Indonesia is not a color which is loved. Yes, because it stands for communism. So, when you title a text Amba, The Question of Red, you have already indicated what is the question of communism and its history and its destruction. So the title is very, very interesting. So the story of this woman warrior, is she male, is she female? The stories that were asked earlier in the presentation by Galia about what is the gender identity of the woman ascetic, male ascetic. These questions continue to plague the role of Amba, who is reborn in various guises. In fact, in the Mahabharata, it is said that Bhishma chooses to die and not fight back because he doesn't wish to die at the hand of a woman, because he knows that Shikhandi is actually a woman who is in the guise of a man. So, to be killed by a woman, apparently in all cultures, is the worst possible thing. It is better to die than to be killed by a woman. So it's very, very interesting. So what she does in this text, and I'm only going to be able to glance at it, is Pamunjak effectively combines the multifaceted nature of the island state's socio-political system and its bloody recent history with the fate of her fictional protagonists. Now, on the island of Java and also of Bali, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are living traditions. People know them as we know them. Some of us know them in parts of our country. And so a lot of the names are derived, as in India, from these epic texts because they convey those epic values. But one name that is not given to any girl child is the name of Amba. And the reason that the name of Amba is not given, because the Amba in the Mahabharata is a character without a destiny, without a home, without any closure. She cannot be ever at any point of time located or accommodated any sphere or context of patriarchy. The story is familiar. I'm not going to go through the story with you except to mention that it is about a woman, Amba, a princess of Kashi, who has two sisters, Amba and Ambalika, and they are also mentioned in this text, who falls in love, and the gentleman also returns the favor, called King Salva. But Bhishma, on behalf of his nephew, goes to seek a bride. He actually wins the bride on behalf of his nephew, and then is taking her back, whereupon she tells him, I actually love somebody else. I'm not going to go into the narrative, but it's the story of a woman who voices her mind and actualizes the fact that her desire to be wedded to the person whom she loves is above the desire of the community to allocate her in a particular space and to accommodate her in a certain domain. Now, this voicing of desire by Amba becomes the crux of her tragedy, because nobody wants her after that. Not Salva, to whom she is sent back afterwards, certainly not Vichitravirya, who's very happy to marry. So Pamunjak's Amba grows up in the 1950s in a small provincial town in central Java. And her depiction is of an ideal Javanese world. It's like an ethnographic picture book of Java that is brought to life in this account. Her father is a teacher. His understanding of the world is deeply saturated in tolerant Islamic Javanese syncretism. He loved Chateaubriand and the Hindu Javanese legends performed thereby. So this is the home she grew up. Her mother, of course, is a former performer of the gamelan. Now, like Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, the mother is only worried, how will my 3 girls get married? So she meets a young lecturer at the university, I think still pretty much the university in Indonesia, Yogyakarta, called Salwa, and she thinks this is to be my son-in-law. So she brings back the proposal on behalf of Salwa to her daughter, and Amba laughs and says, I can't believe you're bringing me back this proposal. It is as if I am going to live that history all over again. And of course, she does live that history, because she gets betrothed to Salwa, but then she falls in love with Bhishma. Now, Bhishma is a seriously cool character in the text, because he is, and Indians will understand, he is an NRI. He's somebody who's foreign educated and returned to India. And he is a doctor to boot. So he is actually a better catch than Salwa, who's just a lowly lecturer in Yogyakarta. And the heart, of course, has its reasons. Now, Amba also goes to Yogyakarta to study. Now, this is something that the mother doesn't want, because she understands when you allow your daughters to read and study in universities, you are creating a future problem. All of us, many of us are part of that. What is even worse is Amba is meant to study English literature. So she reads T.S. Eliot and Sylvia Plath and all of that. And she starts having a sense of herself which is at variance from her position in this society. And then, of course, there is a political situation. As the political situation reaches a head, on 30th September, which I mentioned earlier, 1965, it leads to a momentous attempted coup and the murder of 6 high-ranking generals, which I mentioned earlier. And Bhishma and Amba now meet in an island of Kediri. They start an affair. But on this momentous day, they are in the crowd when this whole mob scene is going on, and they get separated from each other. They never meet again. Now, Pamunjak's text is a feminist text. So guess who suffers in it? It is Salwa who suffers, and it is Bhishma who suffers. Now, Bhishma particularly suffers because she moves out of this world, and there is a third part of this. She moves out of the country altogether. And 40 years later, she's trying to figure out what happened with Bhishma, whom she never met after that day. So it's very, very important to understand that she escapes and evades all forms of surveillance which were there in the original Mahabharata text. So what happens is that there is a series of letters that come from Bhishma when he's incarcerated in the island of Buru. I don't have time to read that, but the island of Buru was the place in which 12,000 communists were purged or died. Now, who were these people on this island? Because lots of communists died. So why is Buru important? Because Buru, from 1969 and to 1970 time, where exact figures 11,498 academics, artists, teachers, journalists, and other political prisoners who were exiled here, they were all killed. So it was a space for a certain kind of prisoner. It is also about, so the killings at Buru are not just killings of communists. It is about the destruction of a tradition of socialist and populist nationalism formed to oppose colonialism and feudalism. And it is this that is destroyed in Buru. This tradition is destroyed. And there is a commentator called Hersri, and he writes in a book, A Memoir from Pulau Buru. One of the greatest tragedies of the 1965 violence was the destruction of the ideals expressed at the time of independence in 1945, political independence, cultural freedom, and freedom from fear and ignorance. This developing political consciousness had grown between 1945 and 1965, despite the country's often problematic relationship with democracy. It was a period characterized by rich connections between culture, literature, and politics, when cultural traditions such as the Ludruk, the Ketropak, and the Wayang were used as tools for political education. Life at the village level was enlivened by social research involving collaboration between farmers, intellectuals, and party activists to initiate land reform. So it was this set of people who were then killed at Buru, and Bhishma is one of them. And these letters that are read by Amba, who doesn't suffer the fate of the Amba of the Mahabharata, are very, very powerful because they tell you that lost history of the artist intellectual who was incarcerated and who was put to death. So Amba then becomes a repository of a history of which she is not a part, which I think in terms of how these epics are really shaping the way we examine shared cultures, shared civilizations, and shared heritage is a very powerful mean, because according to Pamunjak and other writers of her ilk, literature, and particularly the novelistic enterprise, is the only way in which we can enter history and rewrite it. So what you will be able to read is only what is written at the bottom, which is in English. Anyway, it can play at the back. All basically she's talking about is that why has she written this text? And she's giving this interview around at the time 2015 at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And she's saying that we have to examine our past history, and we have to use means by which we can examine this. And part of the rich heritage of Indonesia is the fact that it has preserved both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And she talks about the syncretic culture of her people, and she says, we will use these tools to examine this particular time. We'll stop it now, but you can see now that you have seen her why I was saying that certain people may want to buy, simply because the author is so stunningly good looking. So thank you very much, and thanks.
My topic is spatial acculturation and intertextuality in Malay Mahabharata. John Anderson, in his book Understanding Cultural Geography, he says, a space is that which is created by the intersection of culture and context. As in, a place is nothing but a collection of traces or residues left behind after every occurrence that takes place within that area. These traces are saturated with memories, and they tie the culture and its geography together. In other words, places are to be seen as ongoing compositions of traces whose meanings always change over time. But such an idea is not favorable when it comes to the question of myth. In the case of myths, the idea of spaces stay frozen, as in the places associated with myths and legends possess a certain chronotope, a specific time-space combination. In this time-space capsule, the time remains frozen so that space acquires much more importance in determining the meaning of the place and what it further entails. In this particular situation, the cultural geography of Mahabharata, again, is frozen in a specific chronotope that places it in quite a rigid setting, close to external influences. The geographical places mentioned in the Indian Mahabharata are located in the reader's memory and are spatially oriented to provide structural coherence to the mythical epic. Even if the meanings related to the myth change over time, spatial structures that organize and compartmentalize the story rarely does. The geographical landscapes where the Mahabharata occurs is spread over certain regions, and clear directions have been provided in the text. The mountains, the lakes, the cities, all of them serve to validate the myth. For example, in Mahabharata, one can find the Mount Meru, Hastinapura, Indraprastha, the Lakh House, Kurukshetra, the rivers and the caves. If these function within a specific chronotopic setting, how can the myths comprising these crucial geographical spaces ever spread to another region, yet another culture? How can acculturation then take place through mythical literature such as the epic Mahabharata? Before we move on, An epic loosely follows certain archetypal patterns, where one can observe the larger-than-life hero's adventures, his triumph over evil forces, which then again occurs in a series of sequential frames, wherein the location keeps changing constantly. The places then becomes extremely crucial in not just the process of spatially locating the hero in the literary geography, but also in locating the self in the more abstract geography of the cultural myth and the subsequent ethnic identity. Mahabharata, the story and its geography in the process of transmission, underwent changes when it was introduced to the Malay-Javanese lands. Here it is almost impossible to isolate the Malay from the Javanese setting while discussing historical processes such as literary transmissions. The reason being, there were no clear boundaries in the early period of kingdoms and monarchy. Also, the Malay is an ethnic group and they have always been spread over most of Southeast Asia. Political and geographical boundaries can barely be called so. Boundaries were never fixed or static. It would always be in a state of constant flux, where each ruler tried his best to attract followers. The purported center of a kingdom or polity only served symbolic purposes. Especially in the area of art and literature, they are undoubtedly not mutually exclusive. This fluid geography often led to disarray and chaos, since invasions would be rampant. Thus, art was the principal way in which a kingdom defined itself. Apart from the pleasurable goals that fueled artistic tendencies, it served crucial social functions. An interdisciplinary approach to the text of Mahabharata in the Malay-Javanese literature is necessary to observe the diffusion. Therefore, the epic was constantly constructed and deconstructed across these lands, and it diffused into other art forms such as the theatre and puppetry. As I pointed out earlier, the geography of the Indian Mahabharata is of high significance, but in order to introduce it into a new culture, one needs to find a solution to indigenize it according to the host culture. Also, we need to keep in mind the sacredness that these spaces carry. Or are they sacred at all? Myths in the current situation are seen as a part of the pop culture. But even back then, the question of replication of mythical geography is problematic, since by the very virtue of being sacred, they cannot be replicated exactly. But the very fact that other South Asian versions exist denies the actual spaces of their sacredness. In other words, there is a sense of cleaving of myth and religion. The Hindu religion never thrust itself in a dogmatic fashion upon the animistic Kabatinan religion of the natives. Though not completely stripped of its religious significance, it was not a dominant religious ideology which was in competition with the others. In the essay Notes Towards a Theory of Religion and Revolution, Bruce Lincoln talks about when a new culture enters another culture, there will be the question of religion of status quo, then religion of resistance, religion of revolution, and the religion of counter-revolution. Here what happens is that the culture that entered the Malay-Javanese lands, the Hindu religion, was not exactly religious in nature. It kind of moved towards the cultural domain. So there was not much of a clash between the animistic religion and the Hindu religion, which then gave birth to a peaceful acculturation. Thus, acculturation occurred in a way that the people of the host land could spatially place themselves in the metaphorical, mythical world of the Hindu text without forsaking their own religion. The ways in which such an arrangement was possible needed multiple avenues of diffusion. I have tried to roughly chart out this process, which in turn has produced the intertextual multi-layered literature. By the term intertextual, I also mean to include references and allusions which carry the very features of the host culture and traditions. In the Javanese Malay version of Mahabharata, one encounters the question of replication of the landscape, as I said earlier. The symbol of mountains, for example, has always carried significant cultural and religious token value in almost all cultures. The mountain peak is basically considered to be pointing towards heaven and thus is closer to God. The Indian mountain Meru, which the Pandavas had climbed, takes a corresponding form in the host land, where it becomes the mountain Semeru, which can be located in the host land. Legend has it that the part of Meru was transferred to the host land, and with that, the religious validation of the Semeru has been achieved. Now, this mountain will help spatially locate the Javanese and the Malay version of Mahabharata in the indigenous collective myth structure. The temples in Bali are called Merus, especially the ones built on the slopes of the mountain Penanggungan. The entire geography attains a sacred or a mythogeographic stature, so much so that the great king Erlanga was buried at its eastern foot called Belahan. The Lak House from the Mahabharata, which is situated in the forest of Vanravat, that is present-day Meerut district, transforms into Sigalagala, which is situated in the region of North Sumatra. Also, the Indian version tells us that they escape through a tunnel which opens to the Ganges, while in the version of the Malay Javanese, we find them escaping to Pringadani, which is the kingdom of Hidimbi and Hidimba, that is Arimbo and Arimbi. Pringadani is then again situated in East Java. Indraprastha becomes a Nagamartha, which is situated in North Kalimantan, and Hastinapura becomes Nagasthina. Kurukshetra is yet another important site when we deal with the epic, and that Indian plain becomes the Diang Plateau near Wonosobo, central Java. The term comes from Di Hyang, which means abode of gods. There exist 8 temples on this plateau named after the heroes of the Mahabharata and constructed in the style of the Pallava Dravidian architecture. These miniature shrines represents the cosmic symbolism of the Mount Meru, and the insides of one of these shrines has a casket which is claimed to be the burial spot of King Sanjaya of the Matharam kingdom. These shrines are mere monuments now, and though they are not worshipped as such anymore, they still retain a hold in the mythical space of the subconscious. The above mentioned Matharam kingdom ought not to be confused with the 16th-17th century Islamic Sultanate of Matharam. The earlier Matharam kingdom was of Hindu-Buddhist leanings, and another name by which it is referred to is the Medang kingdom. The kingdom's ancestry is traced back to the semi-mythical kingdom of Medang Kamulan, where Shiva, or the indigenous name says Bathara Guru, rules as king. Kamulan is derived from the word Mula, meaning origin. This localized naming of the places and topographical features helps in creating stable structures in space, which then orient the abstract ethnic self into the indigenous epic. Another way how the epic or myth functions is the manner in which it helps us view or prospect territory. As Robert Talley in his book Speciality points out, the mythical or fantastic cartography thus weaves together a world that is both strangely familiar and utterly novel, bringing together the old myths with astonishingly fresh ones to create a world that is also our own world. Last but not the least is the question of the place Dwaravati that is mentioned as Krishna's kingdom in the Malay Mahabharata. In fact, even the Javanese versions carry the same name. When looked up, the scanty historical evidence concerning Dwaravati tells us that the information is not enough to call it a kingdom. It is roughly dated to the 7th and to 10th century, lasting roughly around 400 years. There have been references to it in the Chinese histories concerning the diplomatic missions between Dwaravati and Chinese rulers. The Ayodhya royalty of the Siam state looked up to the Dwaravati culture. Medals have been found across the regions at different time periods with the inscription that said Shri Dwaravati Swara Punya, meaning meritorious acts of the king of Dwaravati. A total of 16 medals have been found over the Menam Basin, which includes Bangkok and Gulf of Thailand. The Sukhothai kingdom claimed to be descended from Krishna, who was the king of Dwaravati. The figures from the Hindu pantheon were all made rulers of places which geographically is situated in the South Asian scene. This spatio-cognitive mapping plays an important role in localizing the global flavor of the Mahabharata, thereby transforming the old chronotype that it carried. These instances, though mixed with mythical fantastic elements, are rooted in actual geographical regions. But Mahabharata also has Malay versions which move even further from the Kakawin epic form towards a more romanticized narrative called Hikayats. Hikayat is a form of Malay literature which deals with the adventures of Malayan heroes and kingdoms. Versions of the Malay Mahabharata are put together from the Javanese Mahabharata and the old Wayang puppetry. Some of these versions are the Hikayat Pandava Jaya, Hikayat Pandava Lima, Hikayat Pandava, labor, and such. There is no singular Malay Mahabharata. Hikayat Pandava Jaya deals with a specific part of the story, the war to be precise. The description of the story is more humane and abstains from portraying the characters as possessing the all-knowing divine temperament. We find Duryodhana trying to kill Krishna with Karna's help, which angers Krishna and nudges him to show his full avatar. This particular scene deals with the incident where Krishna, who is more like the Pandavas' minister, comes to ask for the promised land from Duryodhana, and we find three chief characters as witnesses to this exchange of words, which include Drona, Bhishma, and Rama. They placate Krishna's anger, reminding him of Draupadi's and Bhima's vow. Later on, when the battle scene is described, we find Draupadi in her own chariot with a green and gold banner, just like any other male warrior. Also, in these versions, Draupadi marries only Yudhishthira, and their son Sang Radhan Kumara is mentioned as an active participant in the battle. This marrying of Draupadi to only Yudhishthira again carries local socio-cultural elements which did not believe in polygamy for women. This is mainly because Islam had already seeped into the Malay culture and they did not believe in a woman having more than one husband, while the reverse was allowed. Hikayat Pandava Labor follows a similar plotline, but even with more deviations, such as the story of Ghatotkacha, which is striking. They describe a certain figure, Vidadari Indrasati, who was in the forest doing penance for her sins when Ghatotkacha's sperm falls into her mouth and she gives birth to Tungal. Tungal is also known as Adi Brahmo, in other words, Achintya. But according to yet another legend, Tungal is also considered the father of Shiva, Bhattara Guru, and Semar, the native god of the indigenous people. Such confusions cannot be viewed in an inferior manner since it only shows the multiple methods that the society employed to integrate different religious sections. Integration of the indigenous god Semar, who is viewed as the native's guardian god, into the Mahabharata as Arjun's servant is another way in which acculturation occurs in the religio-mythical field. But the relationship between Arjun and Semar is not demeaning in any sense. In fact, he respects and follows Semar's advice often. This teacher-pupil relation is much valued in the Javanese Malay cultural value system, especially by the Islamic community. The Muslim community is more Sufi-oriented in their thinking, and the Mahabharata stories, the related puppetry, and the new additional pieces try to incorporate these Islamic ideas into it. One such story that was written in order to bind the Hindu, Islamic, and the animistic religions was the story of Devaruchi. Here we encounter Bhima being sent on a dangerous journey by Drona in search of holy water. His brothers see foul play, including the righteous Yudhishthir, but Bhim, out of his reverence and obedience towards his teacher, goes forward with his task. He ends up killing two Rakshasas and then fights an underwater dragon and finally encounters a tiny man who is an exact replica of himself, who turns out to be Devaruchi or God Tungal, the one I had mentioned earlier. The god tells him about the mysteries of life, parting wisdom, very much similar to Krishna and Arjuna in the battlefield. This is significant as it speaks of the fusion of the person with the god and the path to it that is paved by the teacher who helps one in the journey of self-discovery. This act of merging is referred to as Kaula Gusti, servant and god, pupil and guru, where god is Allah Gusti. This is an example where the mythical value of Bhima is employed to bind the mystic and Islamic thought philosophy into the cultural domain. In a way, the poet of Surakarta, who is the author of Devaruchi, manipulates the myth of the Mahabharata hero to reinvent the literary and cultural cartography in order to bring about a sense of peaceful acculturation. As acculturation had to bring the epic from global to the local, there ought to have been a solid political foundation too to achieve the same. In other words, the new culture, its literature and philosophy first entered the realm of nobility and royalty. One main way in which Mahabharata has served the needs of host culture is in its legitimization of the genealogy of the rulers of both Javanese and Malay lands. In Java during the 10th century, the Mataram kingdom was very prominent, and King Dharmavangasa, the predecessor of King Airlanka, He was a chief patron of arts, and he initiated the first translation of Mahabharata into Old Javanese. It is called Kakawin Bharata Yuddha. It was written by Seda and Panulu in the 12th century. It's based on the Sanskrit prosody, which runs across 4 lines. This is one of the first instances where the heroic Mahabharata figures serve as political tools, as in the example of the name Yudhishthira being replaced with that of the king's name Dharmavangasa. So, the 5 Pandava brothers are mentioned, wherein Yudhishthira becomes Dharmavangasa. So, there is an equation between both the characters. His successor Erlanga legitimized his royalty by drawing parallels between himself and Arjuna in the literary work Arjuna Vivaha. Also, the Majapahit kings were considered that is another kingdom, were considered descendants of the Pandavas and the Bathara Guru, that is Shiva, in one of the Lakons called Pandu Papa, where it is explained that the descendants of the Majapahit kingdom would be taken to heaven with rightful grandeur due to their celebrated ancestry. Later, with the coming of Islam, the end of Hindu kingdoms was justified by the idea of something called Waju Kedaton, which means graced kingship. As in, an item called the oil of life is something which grants political kingship rights on a person. In other words, this philosophy is in opposition to the idea of divine rights theory, which legitimates a specific bloodline in the European lands. But Vaju Kedatan can disrupt this royal genealogy, which is why royalty always tried to validate their line with the mythical ancestry that Indian legends provided. Lastly, we have the Hikayat Hang Tua from the Malay literature, which describes the exploits of Hang Tua, who was an official in the court of Sultan Mansur Shah of the Malaccan court. Majapahit and Melaka were rivals, but both of them are connected with the Pandavas. Hang Tua and his friends are considered to be the 5 Pandavas. Tua is wrongly accused of treason due to adultery with the Sultan's women. But the chief minister knows his innocence and smuggles him out, and he ends up in exile like the cheated Pandavas. Meanwhile, his friend Jabat removes the Sultan from his throne, and Tua is called back to rescue the throne. This is along the lines of the Sajara Malayu, which delineates the relationship between the ruler and the king. More or less, the Pandavas are then used to dictate the people of that kingdom to say that they should not go against the Sultan. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying that these spaces, which were instrumental in localizing the Indian Mahabharata, begin with a mytho-geographical replication and can then be extrapolated into the other thought structures, where the myth offers itself as a perfect item for localized exploitation. The very essential meaning acculturation, the very essential term acculturation indicates blending, which cannot occur in single terms of mere geography, especially when multiple cultures are participating. Geographical, political, and religious integration function in syncretism, while this process is fluidic, which then explains the joint acknowledgement of Malay and Javanese literatures in this paper. Thank you.